those of you who don't know me, I'm Zoe Appleton. I'm a Senior Associate at the Innovation Unit, working alongside with Matthew. So have been one of the delivery partners to the reforms. I've got the very exciting subject, which I'm sure you'll all agree with, is around impact. How do you measure any of these changes? What does it look like, etc.? Within children's social care, we have masses and masses of data. We collect lots and lots of different things for lots and lots of different purposes, lots and lots of different reports. And so what I thought we'd do was just start by thinking about how do we define what matters in terms of what we need to collect. And we've got the national framework, which sets out clearly these 4 outcomes. And we know within these 4 outcomes that 3 of them directly relate to the Families First programme, the ones that are highlighted in blue. You've heard a lot this morning about how the reforms are there to help families stay together. So how are we working differently to enable families to stay together? How are we keeping them safe, both inside and outside of the home? And how are we ensuring that the family network is absolutely brought into supporting? Those 3 are obviously really directly relevant to the Family First reform. The 4th one will indirectly be impacted, because if you get the first 3 right, you've got the 4th one in place. So I just thought it was helpful to just kind of set that as a context for that's your overarching kind of outcomes that these reforms are hoping to deliver on. How do we start measuring whether we're there with any of these? Now, anyone who's ever worked with me will have done a theory of change, no doubt, at some point in their life. And it's a really helpful framework for really just setting out your vision. We heard this morning from Blackburn, actually, having that really clear vision that guided them throughout their reform and their implementation was central, I think. They'll agree. They're nodding, so hopefully that's agreement. That is where you start from. You start with your vision, and as Amanda says, you work backwards from your vision. So you get that shared ownership. And it's really tricky doing a theory of change. It's a really messy process. It's a really complex process. But you really have to kind of almost just trust the process, because it gives you that logic model that starts from where's your vision and where is your starting point. So what's your left-hand column say? There are some tips around what a good theory of change looks like. And it's about really understanding the outcomes that matter most and thinking about this collectively as the partnership approach. What are the outcomes that matter as a partnership? What matters to you locally? And what is the story that you are trying to tell through these reforms? So what does it mean for your families? What does it mean for your practitioners? What does it mean for your wider partnership? And what is that story going to look like? What needs to change? Recognising from what Amanda and Alex and others have just said, not everything needs to change. And actually sometimes let's harness the bits that work really well and just understand the bits where we need to make the differences. And what a theory of change can also really helpfully do is really help to think about the interdependencies. Who needs to work in different ways together, and provide that kind of real clarity about where the impacts are going to be seen. And it really helps to create that shared plan and that shared consensus, because as we've heard from, I think, every speaker this morning, this is a partnership approach. No one in this room can do it alone. They have to do it in a collective way. So actually, how do we build that shared consensus? We have a shared vision. We use a theory of change to get us to that shared vision. What it really also helps to do, which is part of, is about that measuring the metrics. It helps you put in the middle of it, how do we know we're going to have made a difference? How do we know that we started here, we want to go here, what's it mean in the middle? And it helps to sort of look at some of your assumptions as well. So, in proper Blue Peter style, here's a starter for 10 of what a shared theory of change for the Families First programme could look like. And you can see right on the far right-hand side, children and families are supported to stay together. That fundamentally could be the vision. It might not be your vision. You might want to tailor it, think about what it means for you within your own locality. But as an example here, in terms of just taking you through the theory of change, you start with your ultimate outcome. That is where you want to be. And then you work backwards. So what outcomes lead us to that ultimate outcome? What does that mean for children's sense of belonging, for example? What does it mean for how they thrive and achieve their potential? And then we can work backwards again from that and start to think, well, actually, if we want to make sure children are safe inside and outside of the home, what does that mean in terms of our medium-term outcomes? So you build it up collectively and you go through the stages. So that's kind of an example of the theory of change and a kind of a very quick run through of how you might get there. What I just thought I'd do as well is just have a think from what Pathfinders. So it's been really helpful having the Pathfinder panel to hear from them. But in terms of we didn't touch on kind of impact particularly in the Q&A because we were focusing it here, but really thinking about actually how do we know that the work that the Pathfinders are doing is making a difference for children, young people and families. And we've heard some stories, which is great, and we've heard from Blackburn as well, that it's starting to feel differently for families. But how do we know it's feeling different for the workforce as well? And how do we know it's how it feels differently for the wider system? What does it look like? Why do any of these reforms? So to do that, we need to think about three things. We need to think about our outcomes. We need to think about how we measure impact. And then we need to think about how we ensure sustainability of this new way of working. So if I just take each of those in terms. So one of the things we've learned from the Pathfinders around outcomes, and some of this will be common sense to you, is that real importance of balancing the quantitative and the qualitative. So this is not just about metrics. This is not about just measuring your number of strat meetings, for example, although that is important. This is important about the qualitative insights. This is about actually what are families telling us about how this feels. Fundamentally, is this changing our relationship with families and the way in which families feel about working with us? Is it creating trust with practitioners? Is that what's happening through these reforms? So those qualitative insights are absolutely important. Data capture and integration, really tricky. You all, as a partnership, have different capture systems. None of your systems integrate. It's like we're not going to even solve that challenge. But how do you capture and how do you make sure that you're sharing data and creating those multi-agency outcomes? So who's owning which outcome and who's got primacy for reporting on that outcome? So, for example, achieving potential might have an education metric. It might have a health metric. It might have a social care metric. How do we know what each of those metrics are doing to contribute to that ultimate outcome or those outcomes that we're talking about? It's really important when you're measuring change and measuring what matters that you don't just focus on the end product. You're not just focusing on your number of children in the cared for system, for example, but that you actually look at the process. So how's it feeling differently as a process? So how the ways of working feeling? How's it feeling different? But also the economic stuff. I mean, ultimately, these reforms will save money, is the idea behind some of it as well, is that we will have children earlier in the system. So it's worth thinking about that. Talked about theory of change, but I think that as a logic model to really set out your ambition in your journey is helpful. In terms of pulling all that together into an outcomes framework, it's really important the outcomes framework is really clearly sets out what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, and how often you're going to measure it, and who you're measuring it for. So you start to really build up a reporting system that says, this is what we know, and this is how we're going to do. This is how we're going to know that we're making a difference. And actually, if we're not making a difference in the right area, this is what we're going to do about it. So that's your outcomes framework. And then in terms of thinking about impact, you've got your outcomes framework. You know what you're doing with it. But how do you know that that's actually making a difference? So one of the first things to think about is your baseline and also your comparator. And it's really hard. I can't remember which one of you said it a minute ago. We don't know how families felt. Alex, I think it was you. We don't know how families felt before because they weren't necessarily in the system. So it's really hard to know. How do you compare how family X is feeling now compared to how family X was feeling 12 months ago? So there's things we can think about, actually thinking about, well, where are our comparator areas and how do we build up a baseline so we can start to measure the differing views of families and how they think about how it feels. We need the KPIs. We need to think about, well, actually, where are we targeting around some of this? Where do we want to see differences? Where might we need to collect new data? So we heard a lot of this morning about family network meetings. We might need to set up a new metric around FNMs, for example. How do we develop and adapt our reporting system? So the Pathfinders, so I think Luton probably is my favourite example of how they've developed their reporting systems around dashboards, family first dashboards. They've done all sorts of really kind of clever things to really help report on the progress around the families first stuff. The most important thing around this, though, is how are we capturing the voice of the child and their family? These reforms are fundamentally about improving their lives. So if we're not understanding from them how it's improving or changing for them, then we're fundamentally failing. And also with any outcomes, it's really important to consider the unintended consequences and the need to be iterative, because actually you'll find some of these things will work, some won't work, and the whole point of having a clear logic model is you can keep going back to your vision and saying, okay, we tried that, it's not hitting what we wanted to do with our vision, so we're going to reflect and we're going to iterate towards something that hopefully will. So, in terms of thinking about sustainability, I thought this staircase, the second staircase of the day, Sal started with one. Mine's got 10 steps though, Sal. It's from the Early Intervention Foundation, and it just helps you start to think about, and you probably can't read the white on the yellow writing, apologies, but what it says is at the bottom is you can confirm your theory of change. Where you are in the room at the moment is you're probably starting to think about what your theory of, you might not call it a theory of change, but you're probably starting to think about where are we currently. You had to write in your delivery plans back in June, which feels a long time ago, your current state. What's it currently feeling like where you are? And you're moving towards, ultimately, the top of the scale there. If you're going to take it to scale, you're going to scale these reforms. We heard from Blackburn about they started with one locality or two localities, they scaled it across 4 localities. Most Pathfinders are probably somewhere towards refining and testing and monitoring. We heard the test and learn, constantly testing and learning process. Oh no, it was Blackburn, sorry, who was doing test and learn. I'm getting confused. And what's important to say is you don't have to sequentially go up each of these steps. We're not saying you go from the theory of change and then you go up to your logic model, you create your blueprint. You can jump up stuff. You don't have to pilot. Some of your areas might be brave and bold, and you might just go, we know what we're doing. We've got a really clear logic model. We're just going to scale, and we're going to think about taking things to scale straight away. I just thought that was quite a helpful graphic. And in terms of thinking about sustainability from the Pathfinders, one of the things quite a few of them have done is done a lot of thematic reviews around areas of practice that have come up from some of their qualitative insights or some of their quantitative insights to really think through, well, actually, let's delve deeper into this. They've done, and they will say, regular sampling. Do not just speak, as Rachel said on the screen a second ago, co-design is not a one-off process. Absolutely, that capturing voice, measuring that impact over time is really important. It helps create your case studies, it helps create your stories of change, which then help go back to your vision and help to think through, are we making the difference we want for our children and families? Really important to understand partners' contributions. Great to see so many partners in the room today. What's it meaning and feeling like for you guys? What's it feeling like in terms of the contribution you're making and the change that you're seeing? Going back to the shared values, keeping those core throughout everything that you do is really important. And some of the Pathfinders have appointed an evaluation lead. Now, that doesn't have to be someone from the local authority. It could be from one of the partners. It could be from public health, for example, that just takes that lens on evaluation to really understand the impact that you're having